Dr. Ashwin Mehta, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming with us on this series that we're doing together. For those of you who are catching this first series of the podcast, we have done, I think, 3, 4 podcasts around AI and L&D. This one, what we're going to talk about today is the role of L&D with AI. And joining us, as I mentioned, we have Dr. Ashwin Mehta, who has invested probably more hours than any other learning leader that I know in the space of AI and L&D. So nobody better than him. But before we kind of dig into what is the role of L&D with AI and how things are changing, because I think that's really on the mind of a lot of us now is what really. And when we talk about role, a lot of times we're not talking what do we do next year. It's more like where should we see ourselves? What is the vision of L&D really? But before we do that, Ashwin, I thought, well, let's start with what is the role of L&D today as we see it today? Before we can put a pin on the map of maybe where we think it will go, we got to know where we are. So where are we today?
That's a good point. Yeah. What do we actually do in terms of L&D departments? And it's variable, right? Because some L&D
Right.
departments are heavily involved in things like e-learning developments, and they don't really touch things like skills, behaviors, or performance, or intelligence, or any of these other things. And some L&D departments are fairly wide across this spectrum. Some get involved in implementing all the technologies that are needed for these kinds of things, and some really don't. They rely on their IT departments to do this.
Yeah.
Some go off and do procurement, and they survey the market and try and make sense of the sprawling landscape of technology that we have. And some don't. They rely on procurement departments. So the role of L&D, it kind of depends a little bit on the scale of the organization and the remit that they have. In a small organization, and this isn't an L&D comment, this is just any department in a small organization, you get your hands stuck in, you do a little bit of everything, and you make things happen. Big companies have way more structure. They need to, of course, for different reasons, and therefore they have roles and departments where you might have 100 people and their job is to buy things, and you have
Mm.
100 people and their job is to implement IT, and then the role of L&D becomes users of the purchased IT that is then
Yeah.
brought through.
Right.
So it's a sprawling thing, and this is the necessity of business, and this is the necessity of scale. But when we boil all of that away and we think about, well, commonly across all of these structures, what do we see? Well, we see a human capital department. So human capital is HR and rewards and learning and all of these things that come together. Talent acquisition and succession planning and strategic workforce planning and all of these kinds of things. And that is effectively one part of a puzzle. Learning is one part of a slightly bigger puzzle where you're trying to ensure that the organization has the human capital, the people, the skills, the headcount, all of these things, to be able to achieve what the business needs to do as part of an operating model. And that operating model should include people and premises and processes and technology and data and supply chain and finance and all of these
Mm.
things that come together to allow a business to work. So within that, you have people. Within people, you have HR, talent, succession planning, workforce planning, learning, learning and development, and a few other things. So that, to me, that's kind of how it partitions out. And when we think about learning, we think about effectively strategy. So depending on scale of the business, how do we ensure the scalable availability, supply and demand of skills, behaviors, knowledge, and all of these things that make human capital work. And that could be interventions, platform, and data, as we've talked about
Mm.
before. But it could also be performance and impact of human capital. It could be tactical things like management information reporting
Mm.
to the people who are allowing budgets to be released to learning. It could be collaboration between departments. IT is usually a good one to think about. It could be that you have a very small department and you work heavily with the supply chain. But all of these things come together to allow a strategy of scalability in terms of skills.
Mm-hmm.
And within that partition, we then have, of course, the interventions. What are the interventions? Are they e-learning? Are they classroom training? Are they virtual online sessions that an expert delivers? In that spectrum, we're looking at this continuum of training, learning, and development. We could be talking digitally across all of those things as well, depending on training as the risk mitigation measures that a business puts in, through learning, which expands the horizons, and development, which leads to self-actualization. So we have this continuum. We could be talking about facilitation, so coaching, mentoring, virtual instructor-led training, leadership development programs, all of these types of things. And we could be talking about specific scalable programs. So you have I don't know, a manufacturing business, and they want to do something across all of their manufacturing sites to lead a program of excellence that aligns with their strategy. So that's the intervention space. Platform space, L&D sometimes get involved in this, but sometimes it's completely an IT function. You need to
Yeah.
align with a technical
Hmm.
strategy or something like that. And then there's the data side of things, continuous improvement of learning and teaching strategies towards a betterment of the strategy that we've talked about. So typically, this is the spectrum of things. There may be others, but I think this is the core of what L&D do, and then they get involved in things like skills potentially as well. And across everything I've just said, back to the question of AI and
Yeah.
technology,
L&D. Yeah.
it's probably slightly more helpful if we talk about technology broadly rather than just AI. But if that's the current state of what L&D does, then across everything I've just said, you have the opportunity for technology.
Yeah.
And I phrase it as the opportunity because different businesses, again, based on scale, based on appetite for risk, based on appetite for technology, based on money and all of the things that you need to make technology happen, different businesses will be playing to a greater or lesser extent with technology in each of these areas. Some businesses will have an appetite that is very focused on facilitation, very focused on coaching, mentoring, apprenticeships, all of these kinds of things. And that could be part of the culture of the business. It could be part of the necessities of that business. And in that space, there is still technology and AI around things like coaching and virtual
Hmm.
agents, supporting mentoring, thinking about scalable data, identifying trends so that you can adapt learning and teaching strategies. But the other side, the more digital side of things, where you have companies that are heavily investing in things like e-learning, maybe simulations, digital environments, platforms that allow scalable access to these kinds of environments. This is the space that gets way more attention when it comes to
Mm.
technology because effectively you need technology for digital media creation and digital media access, websites and things like that, LMSs, LXPs we call them. You need all of that stuff to allow that scalable access to the thing that you've made. So it's easier to understand the technical space there. And then when it comes to the side of data, having databases, whether it's Excel spreadsheets or you have formal databases in a technical architecture, these kinds of things also, to some degree, need to be part of the L&D skills spectrum. But you can apply technology across nearly every aspect of what I said, from strategy, interventions, platforms, and data, to make these things work, to give you better visibility of data, to understand your impact, to be able to craft the perfect strategy to reach your learners, to be able to quantify your return on investment and make sure that the business is getting what it is, what it should be getting. So I would say that you have the role of L&D, you have the role of L&D with the opportunities for technology, and that allows us to then think about what change might look like from that current state. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking while you were giving me the answer, and a lot of times in when you ask a question, the answer is like, well, here is the answer. Um, this answer is a very long answer and a very hard thing to answer. And so, the entire time in my mind, I was thinking, well, gosh, what a hard thing to nail down. And I've always kind of subscribed to that thought of that is actually what makes L&D such an interesting role within an organization because it serves so many different functions simultaneously and so many different people simultaneously, right? And it has to be, whereas marketers are primarily marketing to your customers. L&D folks, you're trying to train customers, you're trying to train partners, you're trying to train employees, a 65-year-old CFO and a 22-year-old call center engineer, and you have to apply training that's going to work equally for all of them. And so what you're asked to do is so wide. So defining what it is you're trying to do kind of becomes complex. But one of the things that you mentioned was kind of that role of, and I forgot how you mentioned it, Ashwin, but of like transforming the organization. Like just like any role, right? You're intended to add value back to the organization. Now, finance does it through their way, ops does it through their way, and learning does it through their way. And so I think that for me, that was kind of and I know that we've talked about this, you and I then I know on the podcast, and then lots of other guests, kind of how that role of L&D, really that central point is performance and understanding how you play a role in improving the performance of the org. And so like, do you still see that as like the central role? Like if we were to add performance into that, do you think there's like metrics that learning leaders own uniquely to them? I'm assuming no, because it's very hard for any one person to own a metric at a large global scale. But what would you say like are those metrics that kind of become the most important to learning leaders?
So I think just to strip this out
Yeah.
for a second, that I think there are two ways we could look at metrics. But before we look at metrics, I'd like to pick up on a point about marketing, and that is, I've thought about this a little bit,
Hmm.
and I think marketing and learning are basically the same thing. And the reason is that we do interventions
Absolutely.
to
Yeah.
try and change behavior. Now, in marketing, we look at customer behavior, we look at purchasing behavior, we look at engagement behavior. In learning, we kind of look at the same things. It's not
Yeah.
purchasing, but it's
Yeah.
intention,
It's
it's deployment, it's things like this. So I don't see a massive difference between the two, but we do obviously call them different things because one faces the customer and one faces the workforce. But I kind of see them as the same thing. And that leads us into this idea of metrics, because in the world of metrics, we call them metrics in business, but it's data, right?
yeah.
In the world of data, we have effectively two types of, we can partition this into two different areas. I was going to say two types of data. That's untrue. But we can partition this into a couple of different areas. So one is, let's call them vanity metrics, or
Yeah.
potentially junk metrics, or
Yeah.
web
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
analytics. So that is how many people clicked on the button that meant that they saw my thing.
Right.
And I was reading about, was it this week? I was reading about what LinkedIn impressions are, right?
Oh
Because I
my
didn't know. I
gosh.
didn't
Don't
know what
even
they
talk
were.
to me.
So
Don't talk to me about them LinkedIn impressions.
I was looking at it, and it was something like, if somebody has seen your post on their feed for more than like 30 seconds or whatever it is, and that could be that you're just scrolling. You didn't actually read it, but
Yeah.
you just scroll
Yeah.
through.
Absolutely.
And I thought that was a great example to think about our how we view some of these vanity metrics in learning, because we, in a traditional LMS setup where you have e-learning on a system and people will look at
Hmm.
that, what you have click-through behavior. You don't really have engagement. You don't know if somebody's reading it. You don't know if they ignored it completely, if they had it on a
Yep.
different monitor. And some LMSs have ways to control for this. But generally speaking, you're looking at click-through behavior. And if we're looking at click-through behavior, that's no different to any web marketing that anybody else would do.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So vanity metrics, and that is in the traditional sense, we have classrooms, we have people who showed up, how many bottoms were on how many chairs, right?
Yeah.
For how many hours, and therefore that's a measure of something. That's a measure of
Yeah.
attendance, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And and so it's that style of metric where we say, well, we have some kind of engagement, vanity.
Yep.
Then the second type is, I guess, still linked to vanity, but it's around the learning operations themselves. So when we think about learning operations, we might say, let's take an e-learning, factory as an example. We say this many requests come in, this many bits of media came out, and we can somehow measure that, and we can say that based on this much headcount and this much technology spend, we had this many bits of things made. So again, kind of operational metrics, but it's in that space of, it's not telling us anything about the output. Now,
Hmm.
if we draw a line there and then we start to think about output, everything that we do should have some kind of impact on the business, on the employees, on the workforce, on knowledge, on cognitive capability, whatever it happens to be, depending on the L&D department of what they're looking at. Now, is it useful to think about operational and vanity metrics at that point? It doesn't tell us anything about output. It doesn't tell us anything about impact. So when we start to think about the performance of an organization, we start to think about the performance of the workforce. We don't really look at e-learning behavior. We don't really look at how many people clicked on things. We tend to look at, if it's a manufacturing plant, how many bits were manufactured, right? Or how many defects were there? Or how much lost time was there due to accidents, right? So you've got basically things that make money and things that disrupt money-making activities. So those are the two ways you can partition this. And eventually that leads to things that matter to the business. So things that matter to the business, revenue, sales volume, et cetera, product quality, and these things. And it varies from business to business. But generally, when we're looking at human capital interventions, what we ideally want is that people with all the capabilities and skills and technology and resources that they have available to them can be more productive at making more money or revenue or selling more widgets or whatever it happens to be. So these are business operation metrics. Whatever the business is, they'll be measuring things. They'll be measuring inputs, process, and outputs, I/O diagram style. If that's what they're doing, then we should be focusing in L&D on the impact on those metrics. And when we do an intervention, we should be potentially considering things like A/B testing. So you get either you have pre and post testing, or you have two groups. You give one an intervention, don't give the other one an intervention. And see if there's a difference. And this sometimes happens in sales training. So you'll say, well, we've got 25 salespeople here, 25 salespeople there. We're going to give these access to this wonderful simulation, and we're going to give these no access, and we're going to compare the two. And was there a difference in the amount of successful conversations that they had with their clients that led to some kind of conversion into, a contract or whatever that sales function is looking at? So that's an operational metric that we can track by doing some kind of A/B testing. So what I would like to see is a lot more of that happening when we consider the interventions that we are doing. You know what it costs to make it. You know what the throughput is. Have your operational stuff, and whether people clicked on it or not. But do you know if it made a difference? And the only way you can know if it made a difference is to look at ops.
Yeah, and so as a marketer myself, I've realized that much of what I preach to my employees is the same that I end up, we put out in thought leadership and things like that. And I think it is really, you follow this in marketing. HubSpot put out this attract, engage, obtain model. You attract people once they're aware that you exist, you engage them with, deeper down the funnel, and then obtain is you get them to do something. Like it doesn't, whether, and so really, like you said, they're doing the same thing. That model is exactly the same in learning. You attract them to this issue, you engage them with the content, and then they obtain, they actually consume what it is that you wanted them to do. And then afterwards, it's, then it opens back up to value. What value are they getting then from this thing that you delivered? And as long as all of those metrics are there, you're good. So coming back, we talked a lot about the various roles in L&D, from the creating the assets to owning the platforms to connecting with the business. Now, as we look forward and as we look at AI, how do we see that disrupting what our role is today?
Again, depends on what your role is, right? So I guess we know, having laid out already what the current state of L&D is, we know that there's probably a line we can draw that says on this end, we have activities or maybe whole roles made up of activities that maybe they don't add as much value to the business as they could do. And on the other end, we have high value roles. Now, across that spectrum, we also have capability of AI. So
Mm-hmm.
where could we apply AI to some of this stuff? Now, on this side, where we have somebody gives you a PowerPoint, you add an image, you add an X button, and
Right.
then
Right.
and then you throw it back out into the organization and you're done. That whole area of even generating a first draft, making it look pretty, adding some images, maybe some interactivity, that entire area can be done to a large degree in an automated way now because AI
Yeah.
is at that point where you can generate a pretty good looking first draft that needs to be checked by a person but basically is almost there.
Almost there.
So if your role is in that area, and these are typically the developers, the instructional designers of the world, then those jobs and those roles and those activities likely have some elements of risk from AI. If you move the needle ever so slightly and you say, well, actually, my instructional designer doesn't do any of that stuff because what they do is they work deeply back and forth with some people and they do
Mm.
some writing and they do some explanation and explain this to me like I'm 5 years old kind of
Right.
stuff, right? And they summarize and they write bullet points. They can take a 10,000 page PDF and they can summarize it in 5 bullet points. Again, AI can pretty much do that now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there is an element of risk associated with those jobs. So even what I'm describing there is, even if the role is doing something that is quite complicated, it takes a lot of time, it requires a lot of specialist knowledge, we are still seeing to a large degree that those roles do have an element of risk associated with them. If we move up the spectrum a little bit more and we say, well, now we're looking at the folks that lead large programs.
Yeah.
Now, the folks that lead large programs, they probably have a range of capabilities because now we're no longer talking about you have one skill set that you do day in, day out. Now we're talking about you have a range of skill sets and you need to apply the appropriate resources, whether it's technology, people, etc., to a problem that the business has. That role has a lot less risk associated with it when it comes to AI because part of your suite of decision making capability now should be where do I deploy technology and where do I deploy people? Where do
Mm-hmm.
I deploy people that are enabled with technology? And where
Yeah.
do I make sure that that collaboration happens? So the decisions are slightly different, but decisions still need to be made. And because decisions still need to be made that have a capital
Yeah.
or an operational
Yeah.
expenditure cost, then those roles still are to a large degree necessary. Are they necessary in the same volume? Are they necessary in the same
Mm.
with the same cadence? Maybe not. Depends on the business. But I would say the risk on that end is slightly less. We have then on this end of the spectrum we have the high human contact roles. So that might be the deep one-to-one coaching where you need, you
Mm.
know, back
Right.
and forth between people. You need to have some empathy. You need to have some relationship building capability. Probably less risk there, but on the flip side, we have a lot of AI coaching capability coming out even from foundational models and even things like ChatGPT, where you could go back and forth on a problem with something that is an AI agent, and you might get to a resolution yourself.
Yeah.
And there, it's helpful to be able to split out what is coaching and what is mentoring, right? Because there's also a spectrum in that. And when we think about the possibility of going back and forth with somebody who basically asks you questions, but you kind of know the answers yourself, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
What we actually need is something that's really good at asking you questions so you can reflect. Can
Mm-hmm.
we apply AI to that? I think we can. But the human contact side of it, the social learning, the peer-to-peer stuff, the Vygotskian concept of a more knowledgeable other that can provide you with some kind of stretch mechanism, that kind of stuff is so
So
we can
so we
partition it.
yeah. So you've got some of the the more production roles, then as you get to more personal roles, the roles change in different ways, obviously, because you're dealing less with automation than you were today.
Yeah, yeah, and then of course we have the leadership roles where you're accountable for people, for budgets, for adding value to the organization, and I think those to a large degree still need to be done.
So when you look at when I look at this, a lot of this I view as like a short-term role versus a long-term change, right? So like when
Mm.
we were talking, when you were mentioning, the producers, the people that are doing a fairly homogeneous roles day in and day out. It seems like a role of today, like a role of today, is how do I use AI in L&D, right? And if you're
Hmm.
listening to this podcast, hopefully you're doing that job because you this podcast and the other series, you're trying to learn, okay, how do I do that? Because and especially for you CLOs, your other learning leaders out there, that is part of your role today is how am I leveraging AI to build widgets faster, better, more effective, whatever it is. And I see that as definitely like a cornerstone of a lot of learning leaders coming into 2025. We're filming this at the end of 2024, which is just how and how do we create these coaches that have empathy, or maybe we choose to not give them empathy at all. And as you mentioned, they just ask you to, I've seen a lot of these coaching, um, I was just going to say coaching coaches, but coaching agents, bots, whatever you want to call
Mm.
them, that just prompt you to think, um, you know, uh, when was the last time you had a tough conversation with somebody? And how did that make you feel at the end of it, or something along those lines? This is really common in self-help applications. I was just speaking with my wife the other day, and she downloaded this modern. Do you remember Gigapets? I don't know if you remember these little Tamagotchis. They're these little
Mm.
characters that you had to feed and pet, and they were on these
Yeah.
keychains, and you had to give them love, and then they would grow and hatch and become whatever. There's an app, and I don't remember the name of it right now, but my wife was telling me about it, and it's essentially that version. It's a little Tamagotchi, little digital pet you have in your app. But the way that
Mm.
you feed it, the way that you give it love, is by completing these things that are mental health wellness things.
Sure.
Journal, journal for 100 words of journaling. Take 20 deep breaths using this exercise, and like you have to engage. And if you
Yeah.
do, you give them hearts, you give them widgets. So like there's a lot of those elements in coaching that are just one way and actually do make an impact, right? So like how much do I want to go down that route versus do I want it to be a person involved? So it seems like this year and maybe even next year, maybe even for the next 2 or 3 years, a lot of the role will just be how much AI, what does my AI journey look like? But then I feel like Ashwin and where we've talked a lot is like, well, that is almost the short term role of L&D is to do that,
Yeah.
but quickly you will reach your diminishing returns, right? You would have eaten your 18th piece of pizza soon enough,
Yeah.
and you're using AI now. You're gonna, Ashwin, I don't know what you see, 50, 60% cost saving. I don't know what you usually consult with your clients on, but whatever it is, you've already cut your expenditure in half while able to deliver the same amount. But then what's next? We have this
Yeah.
powerful technology, not just AI, but technology in general that's at every step is progressing. What do you see, 3, 4, 5 years from now? How do you see the role maybe evolving with this superpower?
So there are a handful of answers to this, but they all rely heavily on the T word, right? Transformation. We need to
Yeah.
change something, and that's when we take the content paradigm. So the traditional paradigm of L&D, we make content, we put it on a system, people look at it. That paradigm. If we're looking at how do we make content with AI and how do we put AI into our platforms to allow people to find content better, then we're not talking transformation. We still have the same paradigm that we had before. We're just applying AI to some parts of the process. So everything we've talked about up to this point, where we're basically making AI generated content, falls into that bucket. If we think about transformation, I'm one of the proponents of this, and I've got a few other colleagues in the AI space who also are thinking in this way, and that is that. And I read an article on the, dare I cite it, but it's because it's not an academic article, not a peer reviewed article. It was something that came up in my newsfeed. I think it was they named that particular model, but other models are available. But everybody has access to free models. You don't have to pay. You just ask it a question. Now, risks, hallucination, errors, etc. We need to caveat that with you need to check
Yeah.
your sources. But everybody has access to something where they can just ask a question. It used to be like Google, Bing, etc. search engines.
Yep.
But you can go back and forth in a conversation with something that is basically free, that is an alternative to e-learning. And corporate e-learning has, over the years, become a little bit stale, has got a little bit of a bad reputation. Most people don't want to do it because, the click, 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 somebody made me do
Yeah.
this, and it was a little bit boring, and I didn't really want to do it.
Not relevant to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So you get personalized information based on the question, the trigger. As a knowledge worker, there's a trigger. I want to find out something. And you can go to a platform that is free. YouTube is basically the same concept. It's a free thing. You can go and search for information and you can find something else. So when we have all of these things available to us, and on the enterprise side, now let's switch from consumer to enterprise. We now have implementations of things like Copilot, things like Gemini, Google Suite, maybe Claude, maybe an OpenAI implementation or something like that. Lots of enterprises are going down this road. So if they're going down that road anyway, and everybody has access to something that is increasingly more contextually relevant, because if we look at the Microsoft instance, for example, if you're a Microsoft house and you implement Copilot, you can be searching your corporate repository, your SharePoints, all of your data. You can be looking for things that are contextually relevant. Now, if all of that's true, then why do we need e-learning?
Mm.
Nobody has given me a convincing answer to this, because we somehow are reformatting content. We're looking at primary data and we're producing secondary or tertiary data from it. And then we're expecting somehow that tertiary data still has value and a need if we have something that can summarize primary data in our hands. I don't see where the value is of that in a future state where everybody is co-piloting.
Do you
So
think?
that's point one.
Yeah, and I totally, and I was trying to think about that myself of just, well, gosh, do I really need e-learning? It's kind of where I was going. And what the quote came to mind, and I don't know who said it, but it's like, I want to learn, but I don't want to be taught. I don't know if that,
Okay.
there's something like that. It just goes down to, when you force somebody to learn something, they don't feel like they're actually they're being told what to do. They're being told to learn this, but there is inherent value in going through the process and learning something if you aren't inherently a curious person to learn that. And so I wonder, how do you kind of, it's the age-old question. My kids are doing this right now. Why do I need a calculator? Why can't I use a calculator for math? Am I not going to
Mhm.
have a calculator? Why do I need to learn addition, subtraction, whatever? It's because it builds the foundation for you to understand greater things.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and the calculator did not remove the teaching of addition and subtraction in schools, although it is very easily done with a
Mm.
calculator. Or abacus before the calculator, for that matter. So how do you? I agree with you that a lot of these things maybe become obsolete, but how do we get around that idea of, like, there's a lot of a big portion that don't understand that they need education and they don't want it. It
Yeah.
almost has to be force fed.
So this is why I made the point about e-learning, right? Because
Yeah,
e-learning is not the entirety of what we outlined right at the start of this conversation. That is the role
correct.
of L&D. So
Yeah,
we
yeah.
have, on the other side, we have what are intensive or global or sustained programs of
Mm,
development. And when we partition what I said earlier, when we
Yeah.
partition training, learning, and development, training, risk mitigation measure of the business, I need to demonstrate to an auditor, a regulator, or something that I have shown people this information, because that
Right.
absolves me of some kind of risk. Now,
Right.
generally speaking, it doesn't, but
Yeah. Yeah.
that's something for lawyers to talk
Yeah.
about rather than me. But in that space, that's the market that should go, because and not from for two reasons. So reason one is somehow I say if somebody clicked on this e-learning, then that's sufficient for me to discharge my legal duties. Is it?
Yeah.
Is it really? I don't
Yeah.
believe it. Right. But on the other side, you have, well, if we have knowledge workers working in an environment where they are following processes that are standardized or processes that could be automated, why aren't we just automating those processes rather than automating the process of
Training.
creating
Yeah.
content
Yeah.
that they
True.
then have to
Yeah.
follow,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's an organizational development hat there, which learning and development could be looking at and thinking about how do we change the value structure of the business, because the value chain isn't. We've had so many people talking about this on nearly every channel that people. I think you mentioned it earlier. You mentioned, I can't remember exactly what you said, but something around growth mindset and critical thinking,
Hmm.
and the things that we say are soft skills that we want people to go and do. That stuff, usually we say we want the right people with the right information at the right time to make the right decision to make the business happen, right? And if that's what we want, then why do we want those people to be working in an environment where they don't exercise their decision making, where they don't
Hmm.
exercise their judgment, where they just do what they're told because we've trained them to do so? So that's the training side of the business. And that's why I mentioned e-learning, because e-learning, training tend to go hand in hand, because
Yeah.
we need to show somebody some information. When we move up the value chain and we start to think about, well, we want people to be able to exercise critical thinking, judgment. We want people to exercise their relationship building skills. We want influencing, negotiation. We want
Mm.
these kinds of things to happen. Maybe we want some deeply technical programs where you have some complex machinery and you want to be able to understand how it works, and you want to, yeah, pilots, for example, you don't want the first time anybody's having a go to be in the cockpit of a plane. So
Yeah.
you have simulation strategy, and how do you allow people to have experiential learning and to practice and to rehearse and then learn from those experiences and be exposed to scenarios where there is no danger, safe spaces. So you have a whole range of things that L&D does that isn't the e-learning space,
Yeah.
where we could be putting a lot more effort, a lot more money, and a lot more time into making meaningful experiences. Meaningful is the key word there, because ideally what we want is for somebody to be exposed to new stimulus and make meaning in their minds, generate knowledge, and then apply that knowledge. So if that's what we can do, then why don't we do that and divert the resources that we had before into these more meaningful things? And depending on the business, the meaningful thing might be something different. But there is a range of things to consider in that space.
And yeah, and Ashwin, that's really where I see, that last bit is like, to me, the future role of L&D and AI is like, and I think honestly, I think a lot of L&D leaders would agree that we've been trying to pull the business there for a while. You know, why do you want us to create this training? Tell us why you need this.
Yeah.
What business metrics are going to improve? And the answers we get back are not always the best answers, right? And so we go off and we create a training program, and maybe it doesn't have the biggest impact because we knew at the beginning, anyways, that there wasn't real impact to
Mm.
be made. But I think as learning can step out, and you mentioned maybe um, play a bit more into that operational role of like, oh, we want this agent, this person to take this data and like search up an answer, like a call center agent, right? Like, okay, their job is to I don't know, point people to a website or forget their password or whatever. And it's like, well, we have two options, and this has already been automated, so partially automated. But right now, if I forget my
Mm.
password, what do? I click a button, forget password, shoots me in my email. Now, I am sure there is still a number of people that is confusing for. So they call in and they say, I forgot my password. What do I
Yeah.
do? And I'm sure there is a person who actually has to talk them through that. So now you have two options when you're an L&D leader, when you're given this information. Somebody comes to you and says, we need to train call center reps on how to help customers find their password. And it's okay, I can do that, but it's going to be the same for everybody, correct? Yeah, because all we do is we actually take them to the website and we have them or we type in their email for them. And then we tell them to go to their email and check that. And, well, there's pretty good AI agents that can talk. And this is a highly scripted thing. We don't
Hmm.
need it to create a complex answer. These are not level 3 customer requests that are trying to add a hotel room. They have a layover in Denver and they want to add a hotel room and paid for by
Mm.
Alaska Airlines. This isn't a highly complicated thing. So like their role
Yeah.
could be, well, why wouldn't we just create an agent that can talk back and give them this information without an actual person having to be in that role? Because that seems like a
Yeah.
very solvable problem. So I think that, would you agree that kind of that's the large picture of all of this is the future
Yeah.
role of L&D is to not is one to apply a lot of things we talked about and to make sure that when there are those large the keywords transformations that they become an agent in those and invest serious money, butts and seats, grabbing people and changing hearts and minds, all those things that are
Yeah.
high cost but high reward things. Continue to invest in those areas, but then be able to have the business mindset and operations mindset to notice that when you're being asked to do something, not that you have to know how to do it, right? I don't think anybody's saying the L&D person needs to know how to train a live agent how to talk, but to loop in operations and say, hey, sales is wanting this job done by this person. I honestly feel it's better done by an AI person. Um, would you agree that's kind of where you think that's headed?
So a couple of comments, right? And I think the first one is you. I was listening as you were talking, and you went from learning leaders to L&D, right? While you were talking about that, and I
Yeah,
think what I said earlier was organizational development and how you structure roles and how you structure the
yeah,
operating model is ever so slightly different from learning. But when we talk about learning leaders, not learning servants, learning leaders, right?
right. Yeah, yeah.
There's a difference in working with the business and saying, what are we measuring? Where should we be investing our resources? Can we change the operations here and do something that's better value for the business? That would be a leadership call
Mm-hmm.
versus I need some training made for this. Can you do it? And I just go yes every time. So there needs to
Yeah.
be a difference in behavior. And the behavior is, can you challenge your business and say there is a better way to do this? And that then takes you down the road of, well, we could have virtual agents here. We could automate this because it's script based and it sounds, I don't know a lot about call centers, but it
Right.
sounds top of my head that
Right.
anywhere where a person is following a script, that role probably to a large degree can be automated. But anywhere where somebody needs to make a decision, it's a difficult call. That's where the people need to come in. So there's
Mm-hmm.
probably usually you see a first, second, third line support kind of model,
Yeah, yeah.
and the first line support can be pretty much automated. So that takes us down that partition where you say, well, am I a leader in my business? And if I am, then I can be having those multidisciplinary conversations about operations where we can be talking about human capital deployment, technology deployment in a way that's collaborative, in a way where people work with technologies and you get the best for the business. It's a very different conversation to, can you make me some training? Yes, I can. So I would challenge the leadership part of that because that's the critical part to be able to have those conversations.
Well, and I mean, I don't know. In my opinion, I think that is the future role. Like, you feel like I'm on repeat here of L&D. I mean, not L&D for the workforce today, right? Is uh, workers are going to continually to pay more for those things that can't be done with technology, or
Yeah.
perceived can't be done with technology. And so the future role of anybody is to find a way of how you can sit alongside these tools to make these decisions to make a business decision. So it's not just, that's not really even that's not a specific to L&D. I'm having these conversations with a lot of my teams in marketing and in sales and in leadership and in learning. We're all having these same
And
conversations.
funnily enough, CTOs and CIOs as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. So it becomes it becomes part of like the future of skills, if
Mm.
you would. And so if we if we explode this out a little bit deeper, we talked about metrics earlier. One of the things I'm thinking is, well, if I'm in learning, the metrics that I want to know, that I want to touch, are the ones that the business, are red alert items for the business. Like things I'm thinking about
Mm.
right now, just as an example, right? Like, okay, like how long does it take for me to onboard somebody? And like, and and how much does the resource cost that I'm onboarding?
Mm.
And is there a way that if I could take somebody right now, maybe right now we're paying somebody 50 an hour, and it takes them a month to be onboarded. Could I find somebody that was 30 an hour, give them an agent via their tablet, and
Hmm.
send them off and running on their merry way? Maybe it still takes them a month, but now I'm paying 30 an hour because alongside them, they have their co-pilot, I didn't mean
Yeah.
it from the Microsoft. They have their assistant, their, AI
Hmm.
assistant sitting alongside, you know, um, and I'm like, I feel like that would be kind of where my mind would be going is where is the most money being spent on our people today?
Mm.
And what can my influence be on where this money is going, knowing that the organization, most organizations, the vast majority of their cost is in their people. And so if I can find those high cost areas and find a transformation, again, either make a lot of their e-learning done quicker, better, faster, whatever, or make e-learning obsolete, sit them with an agent, or change the
Yeah.
type of person that has to be in that role. That seems like a big area that I would almost be trying to force myself into those conversations instead of somebody trying to bring me
Yeah.
into them.
So I think I mentioned it on one of our other sessions, which was the concept of task fit and task fit analysis, and
Mm,
that is the this combination of where you can deploy technology, where you can deploy technology with humans, where you can deploy humans,
mm-hmm,
what the relative strengths of each of those opportunities are. There was a BCG report on this a few weeks ago, which I mentioned before as well. So this kind of thing for me sits in the performance or operating model or the strategy or the or organizational development spaces. And the question would be, is this an L&D role? For me, L&D needs to shift into one of these other areas, most likely.
mm-hmm,
Looking at performance, looking at impact, looking at business intelligence, looking at things like human capital strategy, thinking about the human capital in operations, and that's slightly away from a traditional L&D role. And I think this change is needed, and I think it's absolutely possible in the industry with the L&D teams that we have. But it does mean either upskilling or it means that sort of repartitioning of roles and moving away from things
mm-hmm.
that AI can do very well. So I would say there is a change needed, but the only doubt in my mind, the reason that I'm questioning this, Nolan, is that is this in the future going to be called L&D or should it be called
Mm,
something else?
yeah, I was talking to a client on Friday, and they were saying, um, there's this big kind of transformation of, and we ourselves just rebranded and came out with a new website and changed our language. We're really saying we support from recruitment to essentially, offboarding.
Mm.
And that instantly puts you into a different realm, right? When you start saying,
Yeah.
well, if I'm going to be looking at recruitment strategies and who are the people that need to be on the bus and what seats should they be in, that is not a traditional L&D role, right? Now you're in
Mm.
what traditionally has been in HR. And so I think, and where we could probably spend another just hour talking about is really how those two roles, I think, are going to evolve over time. Your HR and L&D, and what does that look like with those two things kind of merged together, and the ownership of the person comes a little bit closer together. I think that's going to be a fairly interesting point, as you mentioned. Do they come more into the ops side or more into the people side, or maybe both?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think rather than me make a prediction or you make a prediction, I think we're gonna, to some degree, see how this shakes out through 25. Different businesses are going to call it different things, but
Yeah,
I
true.
think it's all people at the end of the day, right?
Correct.
What do we do with people? And we have all of these sticky situations outside of in wider society, like shortened working weeks and universal basic income, and workforce displacement on scale that are rightly being discussed by other folks that are going to some degree influence this debate in different companies.
Yeah, totally. Well, Ashwin, thank you so much. I don't even know if we were able to cover. I remember when we started thinking of which podcast to do in this AI series, we had said that maybe we would cover this within a different one. And we said, no, 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 that's too big of a topic. Let's make it its own. And here we are, an hour, and they still feel like we've just scratched the surface. So maybe that needed to be its own series. But thank you for helping me us diagnose this area that we're in today, which is an ever evolving area, and it will definitely be interesting to see where it goes. So thank you again, Dr. Ashwin Mehta, for joining us on this podcast today.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Nolan. Thank you for having me.